Thanks, Mickey. I was, since I'm paying for the room, I'm going to ask the first question. The and I think, I mean, I'm going to start directing it to Ted, but I'm not picking on Ted in particular on this. When you talked about the issue, there's actually, I mean, the legislation we're talking about, in a sense, does three things. It legalizes the illegal immigrants who are here, which is really sort of what you were talking about, in a sense, focusing on. It makes promises about future enforcement that supposedly we're not going to have, you know, another 11 million illegal aliens. Take those promises for what you will, but that's a big part of it. And then the third part is very large increases in future immigration. And so my question, again, I'm starting with you, Ted, but it doesn't, anybody wants to speak up, please do. It seems to me that the kind of thing you were focusing on about sort of a shift in tone and, you know, away from Lou Dobbsism and what have you, would be relevant specifically in talking about legalization, about amnesty, but wouldn't necessarily relate to future immigration. In other words, is it a kind of unacceptable view that you amnesty people who are here, but you don't continue immigration at very high million-plus levels every year? Do you see what I mean? In other words, how would those necessarily be tied? And I mean, obviously, I don't even mean ideologically, but from a news coverage. In other words, do you see that as a possible perspective that, you know, sort of the circles you travel in would be acceptable?
I think looking at immigration reform and these three different prongs that Mark's talking about, one piece, we actually did a series on the 1986 immigration reform law that launched on Sunday, and we're releasing pieces right now. But one of the things we did was put together this like minute and 30-second video that sort of explains what happened, and obviously in a straightforward way. But one of the things that I think is an important factor to take into account as to how we got to 11 million undocumented people in this country is that there were no viable pathways for the vast majority of those people to come here. They, you know, for whatever we spent on the border, they still came into the U.S. either on a visa, as about half of people who are undocumented do, or by crossing somehow. And when they got here, they got jobs and worked in places, and perhaps with fraudulent papers, and perhaps because employers were looking the other way. But in any case, we're looking at 11 million people here, and one of the ways we've tried to answer that over and over again is by spending more on immigration enforcement. And we're talking now, in the 2012 fiscal year, $18 billion spent on immigration enforcement, and that's more than the federal government spends on any other law enforcement combined. So you're talking FBI, you're talking DEA, things along those lines. So could you spend more on it? Sure. I mean, you could spend more on anything, hypothetically. Is that the most effective way to deal with this issue? I personally think it hasn't been very effective. You know, we're talking about the 1996 immigration law, which focused heavily on enforcement. And now we're going on 20 years later of that and still talking about the problem. So I think, personally, I do think opening the doors up, as I've heard Grover Norquist say, you know, build the fence as tall as you want, as long as the door is big enough, that's all I care about. I do think it makes more sense to have legal pathways for people to come to the U.S. I personally think that's why labor unions are on board with this. They would rather have a worker here who's on the books than a worker who's not on the books. It just makes sense from a wage standpoint of view for them. From a pro-business standpoint of view, there may be businesses that prefer to have their workers here without papers, of course. But I think when we're talking about wages, it's just common sense at this point for the unions. They see the equation as these are future union members. These are people who could be in our ranks, and right now, or maybe they're current union members even, but right now they're not getting the benefits that legalized workers would get. So as for how that third piece relates of opening the door wider, I think it's essentially you can keep spending and spending and spending, but you know, a triple layer fence, it's like there's an Onion article about the Mach 3 razor when that first came out, and it was like they're going to 3 blades on your razor, and excuse my language, but he said, you know, it's a fake. It's the CEO of Gillette, and he says in the Onion, you know, F it, we're going to 5. And then the Mach 3 actually came out with 5 blades on their razor. So it's when you think about the fence, do we want to go triple layer? Do we want to go 5 layers? We could go 10 layers. Spend all you want, but at the end of the day, I don't see that solving this problem.
Thanks. Yeah. Oh, no, Mickey, yeah, go ahead. You had something,
I just see
please.
this as the triumph of, when I was in the left in the 60s, was just at the point when good old-fashioned Marxist class politics was being replaced by multiculturalism. And so you weren't, you know, we old Marxists thought everybody's a proletarian, white, black, brown. And then these people came out and said, no, the brown has a unique perspective. And I see this shift that Mark talks about, where if young people really not only want to give amnesty to people here, but also want high levels of virtually unlimited future immigration, I think it's driven by diversity politics. I mean, if you run for office in California, you will learn it is all about the ethnic appeal to Latinos. That's the entire ball game. And if you're opposed to amnesty, Piolín will get on the radio and say, so-and-so doesn't like the brown man. And that's the level at which I think voters react to it. And it seems to me it is the triumph of ethnic politics over class politics, because there are victims here who the press could report on if they wanted to report on victims, who are the low-wage non-immigrant workers who are living much inferior lives because of mass immigration. But they don't, and it's not because they're not Marxist enough. If they were Marxist, they would report it. If they were leftist, they would report it. It's because of the triumph of ethnic politics.
Gregorio, yeah, in the back, please. Speak up if you could say who you are, too.
My name is Gregorio Veraz. I'm correspondent for Televisa News Network. I've been working for about 10 years in the area San Diego, Tijuana. And I work, as Jerry, a lot of issues in regards to immigration. And I've seen that since 1994, when the issue of illegal immigration was raised by former Governor Pete Wilson, there were many efforts to build double and triple fences and deployed a lot of personnel along the border, secure the border. And I've seen that apparently what this measure did was to increase the illegal immigrants in the U.S. Because, as you know, before there was a kind of circularity. People used to go back and forth, and there were about 4 billion people. But when the border was secured, then we saw that many people, instead of leaving the U.S., was bringing people. So I think the U.S. government have invested billions of dollars in measures that I believe are not working. Do you see also this with this vision? I think this is a waste. Maybe the best way, as Ted was mentioning, is to set up regulations to bring people orderly and according to the needs of the companies, etc.
Gregorio, you raise a very interesting point. I think it's a good point. I think there are some people who have decided to stay rather than go back and forth, but I think there are multiple factors at work here. In part, there's the shift away from seasonal agricultural work into full-time jobs. In parts, there's the post-IRCA movement of migration and the spread of migration networks across the United States. Philip Martin, a professor at UC Davis, says that the principal effect of IRCA in '86 was to spread migrant networks across the U.S. as people got legal status, got amnesty, could move around and send the word back home, hey, there are jobs here, come on up. And once, of course, you're living in New York or New England, going back home is far more difficult. And then you have the fact of we have a lot of migration from Central America, and the difficulty, just geographical difficulty for those folks is obvious. But clearly, the point you're raising is a good one, and it's part of a complicated overall picture, I think.
Yeah.
Do you have a follow-up, Gregorio?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up. I want to know, you have covered, like myself, the border, and you know that the people that is moving illegally, undocumented people to the U.S. Have a lot of resources, and they have corrupted many U.S. agencies, immigration, border patrol, and we have seen that in too many cases, they allowed people to come into the States. So, at some point, the investment in security along the border doesn't work that much because you are still having this possibility. I mean, these organizations are using that possibility, bribing people in this side of the border. They can bring drugs, people, and
I get the point, Gregorio. Go ahead.
Just very quickly, I think this goes to a point that Don raised about interests that are at work here. I think a lot of Congress people are happy to throw money at border security, and they have shown very little interest in cutting off the jobs magnet, very little interest in worksite enforcement, which of course is what IRCA explicitly promised if you read President Reagan's signing statement. And financial interests are at work here, it seems to me, diverting the effort away from the worksite, which is why if you're not skeptical about what's going to happen in terms of worksite enforcement, I don't think you've been paying attention to what has been going on for the past 30 years.
Roy Beck, speaking from 25 years of being in the newsroom myself, I want to follow up on something Mickey said and ask you, Jerry. This idea of ethnic concerns, and maybe Don's got the key on this, but I don't see much interest in Hispanic Americans. I see interest in people who are here illegally. I see interest in people who want to come here, but I don't see any immigration reporting that is looking at the growing poverty of Hispanic Americans, the incredible increase in unemployment, the fact that most Hispanic Americans are stuck in, well, I shouldn't say stuck, they're in occupations that have had this decline in real wages. If the media was really driven by an ethnic bias, I would think that that the reporting would be focused, at least partly, on how immigration affects Hispanic Americans. I see almost none of that. So, I mean, obviously, if you just say, well, the media is just doing it for the corporate sponsors, that would explain it. But it seems like it's more complicated than that, because I think Mickey is right. There is a tremendous amount of sort of multicultural kind of concerns in the newsroom. But why the lack of interest in Hispanic Americans?
I think you answered it. It's economic bias. It has nothing to do with.
Is that all of it? I mean, it's just...
Absolutely. I grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, the western end of Pennsylvania,
Don, can you talk into the mic?
which was, I didn't realize it at the time, but it was multicultural because the phrase hadn't been invented yet. We had a Croatian social hall, a Serbian social hall, an Italian social hall, a German social hall. You can go down the list of every ethnic group imaginable because they worked in the steel mills or the coal mines. So it was hugely a multicultural community. And I keep wondering, going back to that time, because if there was any class warfare going on, I never saw it. And maybe it's because everybody was just trying to do better for themselves. I don't know. But this today is economics, pure and simple, nothing else.
Ted?
I think, I think the question kind of presupposes a few things, and one is it's important for us to look at the actual economic impact that immigration has, whether it's on the books or off the books. And I think you can see that different think tanks are putting out different figures. We have Heritage coming out today with their number on what they think the impact of immigration reform could be. I've written about reports that have said it could, Heritage is saying it could cost, what, trillions? Is that right? Trillion, yeah. But of course, there are reports that look kind of in a broader way as to what the other factors that immigration could have on the economy that say that it could generate 1.5 trillion in GDP gains over a decade or so. I've broken them both down. I haven't had a chance actually to look at Heritage yet, but I've broken down reports that, look at the positive impacts, and some say immigration reform would bring big positives. Some say they'd be more mild. I believe even, and I'm not sure you guys can clarify for your organization, but I've certainly heard that in general, people look at the economic impact of immigration as a net positive. So I just want to clarify that. And I think when we're talking about including Hispanic Americans in the dialogue, I do think that's important. And hopefully, we're hoping that's one thing that we'll be able to do with our network, Fusion. Looking at the package we did on the 1986 immigration reform, one story stood out to me, and it was a story of someone who came to the U.S. illegally and worked as a dishwasher for a number of years. And he eventually gained legalization through the 86 immigration reform. And one of our reporters was able to catch up with him today, and now he's a business owner who actually he co-owns one of the restaurants where he washed dishes at years before, and owns a separate restaurant on his own, employing a bunch of different workers in all capacities you would have in a restaurant. Not to say this is a kind of experience that happens from every single person who comes to this country for whatever way, but I think it is illustrative to the economic impact that immigrants do have.
I'd like to say something just quickly in response to Roy. I think the mood in the Latino community, certainly in Arizona, which I know very well, shifted. In 2004, there was a proposition called Prop 200 that was intended in the state to deny certain services to illegal immigrants. And according to exit polls, 47% of the Latino vote, which in Arizona is almost all Mexican-American vote, was in favor of this Proposition 200, despite the fact that there was a well-financed campaign calling it anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican, xenophobic, and that sort of things. And despite the fact that the state political and economic establishment was against Proposition 200, it passed with almost half of the Latino vote. Things shifted when the mood became more angry, and people like Arpaio and Russell Pierce began to make Mexican Americans in Arizona feel very uncomfortable. They thought that they were being attacked, and their own legitimacy was being attacked. And I think that was a terrible mistake made by some top Republicans, and it made many Mexican Americans in Arizona feel this is not just a question of illegal immigrants putting too much pressure on our jobs, our communities, our schools. It's now a question of us versus them. So I think the framing of that issue on the ground in Arizona for Mexican Americans shifted dramatically as a result.
The media basically doesn't cover the issues of poverty among Hispanic Americans because the Hispanic American leaders are not advancing those issues right now.
I think they would rather not report on that narrative. Okay. It's not part of their narrative.
Yes, sir, yeah. Can you identify? Wait for the mic and identify yourself, please.
Hi, my name is David Holtzman. I'm from Lexington, Massachusetts. A couple of points. One
Just a question, please.
You sure, Mark?
Yeah.
Boy.
Well, then give me 1 point and then let them respond. No speeches, please.
Okay. First of all, it's more instructive to put the cost of amnesty into per capita. And the Old Heritage Foundation, I think it was about $2.4 billion. I calculated that was $82.80 per American citizen, $8,280. So that dramatizes it a little better. Let's see. Second, I thought that $18 billion for enforcement was debunked already. Isn't that?
Well, I don't want to discuss the substance of the issue. I want to talk about the media coverage of it. Did you have a question?
No, in that case, I think that's it.
Okay, well, thank you. Anyone else? My question, was there someone else? Was our hand up?
I see Santiago arrived from Notimex.
We don't want to put him on the spot
Okay.
unless he's got a question. I wanted to actually kind of respond to something Roy said, and in a sense, sort of off of what Ted said. Now, the story about the dishwasher who came to own the restaurant, that's a great story. I mean, that's that's the kind of thing reporters should be writing about. It's an interesting, Horatio Alger kind of story, but there's the other side of that. And even if there is clearly a net, very small net economic benefit, labor market benefit from immigration, but that comes from a lot of people losing and a lot of other people winning, and there being a little bit of difference between them. And what I don't see stories about anywhere, and I'm not singling you guys out, but anywhere, I mean, is, stories about those people who are losing as well as those who are winning, not just Hispanic Americans, but anything else. And that, I think, really is sorely lacking. I mean, there's a particular kind of sob story, to put it derogatorily, that the media will do on immigration, and it's always the same sob story, as opposed to a mix of sob stories, because there really are, people in detention who end up, dying of something. I mean, that's a legitimate topic, but there's also a legitimate topic of, all the middle-aged African-American men who used to clean the offices in every Los Angeles office building who, almost all at once, never, lost their jobs. Or even, there was just a cover story last year in Washington Post magazine about the McDonald's south of the Capitol. And it was sort of a encouraging story of the manager and how he's running it, and he's a Salvadoran who's here on TPS, and anyway. But the fact is that what they didn't talk about is that store went from being all African American staff, then it was bought by a Cuban franchisee, and now there's one Black American left who's working there within a period of months. I've seen it myself. The restaurant across the street from our office. I'll say it anyway. It's a Cosi sandwich place. They had a Black manager, all the staff were Black Americans. It worked. He was transferred to another place. Almost overnight, the entire staff switched to Hispanic. Now, that's a story, and that's a story that never gets covered. And that's kind of the thing that's always concerned me. Anyway, I'm ranting now. Yes, Ellen. Wait for the mic and identify yourself. You haven't, where's the mic? No.
When are we going to see more coverage of the actual cost of all this, especially illegal immigration? For instance, to the taxpayer. All you have to do is look at Montgomery County school system and see how it's changed over the last 20 years. And this subject is never covered. The true cost of illegal immigration.
Well, I'll let anybody answer afterwards, but it raises an interesting point. There's a lot of writing on coverage, on cost. Heritage has got this big report out.
No, but in the newspaper.
Even in the newspapers. But the point, though, is the costs, even however they're balanced, the cost at a local level. In other words, it's very difficult to get, schools will not generally cooperate and tell you what the costs are. Now, there are going to be counterbalancing benefits. Everything has costs and benefits, and you can argue about what they should be, but it's very difficult to get schools, for instance, they just won't tell you what they're spending sometimes on as a result of immigration. And, again, it's not that has to be the story, it's that it's a picture that's missing some colors. That's my concern.
All right.
Yes, Gregorio.
When you talk about bias of the American media, do you refer just to New York Times, or have you analyzed the coverage from Washington Post or TV networks?
Well, I read a lot of newspapers. I was a reporter for over 30 years, Gregorio. I'm a news junkie. And, there was a quotation in our pieces here from Robert Samuelson, who talked about the journalistic groupthink that basically frames those who raise questions as bad people. And he said that this detracts from democratic dialogue and reflects poorly on the profession of journalism. I think there's a great deal of truth about that. I think it's for the best of intentions. Every immigrant has a story. That's why enforcement of immigration laws is so difficult. It's a real live human being who's affected there. And I derive a lot of my guidance on this issue from someone like Barbara Jordan. Certainly no one ever called Barbara Jordan a racist. She was an icon of the civil rights movement. And she said that in order for immigration policy to make any sense, we have to establish limits, and in order for limits to be coherent, they have to be enforced. Enforcement is very difficult, but I think it's necessary to have a coherent immigration policy and to have the success of the immigrants whom we do accept, because I think there should be like a social contract where we as a society agree to do all that we can to integrate, to incorporate, to help people become part of the American dream, a pluribus unum. But I do think, and I certainly sensed it in my old home state of Arizona, a resistance when they're feeling that they're overwhelmed, that if I embrace people, it just more people are going to keep coming. There is a great desire, I think, for a sense that this issue is being managed, and that there are limits, and that those limits will be observed, respected, and when not, enforced.
But what do you think about the mainstream media in general, the TV networks? For example, I can see that in other press conference of the immigration reform, they have the room filled of reporters, and I do not see too many reporters here.
Well, NBC did an excellent report with hidden camera footage from the border showing the reality of border insecurity in southern Arizona and in South Texas just over the weekend. I thought that really surprised me. I wanted to ask Ted, I mean, as a partner of Univision, the Spanish language network, has a real line. I mean, it is an open advocate for comprehensive immigration reform, for illegal immigrants, and it's part of the ethnic press. And I think ethnic press in our country has always favored the people from the old country. But does that affect your framing or your work there, Ted?
I mean, I think my view on journalism is that every story has an angle to some degree. I certainly didn't read Jerry's stories thinking that they didn't have an angle. I mean, they're more like blog posts, but I think for sure, I mean, when I go into reporting stories, there are certain things that I think are important. Humane treatment of immigrants, in our society is definitely important. Regarding same-sex couples as equal, that's something that I don't think is, it is being debated in society, but I don't have a problem saying right now, I don't think that's something that, that I see both sides of that issue on equally. I think it's important for journalists to be upfront about who they are and what they're writing, and I think, as I was telling Mark earlier today, I came from magazine journalism where when you go into a story, it's about getting the facts, and it's also about telling the reader how you saw things and what you learned from getting those facts. And that's part of how I do my job. I can't speak for the other reporters that are part of the joint venture that I'm.
Gregorio, may I ask you?
Mickey wanted
okay,
to follow
sorry.
up on something.
I think it's even worse in Los Angeles and California than it is in the New York Times. I mean, when I ran this sort of quixotic campaign for Senate, and they had two planks. One was skepticism about labor unions. The other was opposition to amnesty. And this is how the LA Times doesn't like to write about fringe candidates because they're not serious, because the LA Times doesn't write about them. So there's sort of a circularity there. But they finally did a story the day before the election, and this is how they summarized my position on immigration. I'm upset at the party's refusal to deal seriously with immigration reform. So it made it sound like I was an advocate of comprehensive immigration reform, despite all my best efforts. And the woman who wrote it is Robin Ebkarian, so quite a good reporter and a very nice person. And I realized that was the problem. Opposition to amnesty is so toxic in Southern California. She thought she was doing me a favor by removing the stigma of racism and ethnocentricity that would just toxify me among my friends. So she couldn't even bring herself to summarize in words what I was running on in the paper. It's sort of in the New York Times they will attack opponents of immigration reform, but at least say what they are. And the LA Times is so toxic that they sort of can't even bring themselves to put the words on the page.
There's a question? Neil? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you.
Hi, this is Nolan Rappaport. I haven't seen much coverage on Congressman McCall's border security bill. I was wondering if that's just my imagination or there's something to that.
No, I don't think it's your imagination. Should there be? I mean, well, why should there be? Tell
Well,
me.
it's a bipartisan effort to come up with a solution, border security. It has the ranking member, Mr. Thompson, and the ranking member of the Border Security Subcommittee, Mrs. Jackson Lee, as co-sponsors. And of course, it was introduced by the chairman of our Homeland Security Committee in the House. I would expect it to get more coverage.
I don't know what to tell
Yeah, I
you.
don't know what to tell you either. I mean, I think that's not so much an ideological thing as my guess is it's sort of the storyline is, there's Chairman Goodlatte and then there's the gang of whatever there is in the House, and that's sort of those are the players on the field. I mean, in other words, my sense is it's not necessarily an ideological thing, but I don't know. Was there a question? Well, there was a question in the back there. Could you hand them? Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Jennifer from NBC News Channel. Quick question as a follow-up to Jerry when you mentioned Spanish media or ethnic media, as you mentioned. Do you believe that when they do provide coverage on immigration reform, that Spanish media per se has their own agenda and how we could better, I guess, fix that, for lack of a better term?
I think it's an agenda, but I understand it. I don't understand it when I see the agenda in the American press. I think it's very personal for the Hispanic media. Many reporters live in the community and know people whose lives are directly caught up in this. And so I don't expect there to be objectivity. I do think it would be good if there were occasional reporting on the concerns that are raised by people like us. I know when I watch Jorge Ramos, and I read his books, he says that people like us are not motivated by legitimate concerns. He says it's puro racismo. I think that that's unfortunate, journalistically, socially, civically, and it distorts a very complicated story. But at the reporter level, it's been painful to me. I've lost a couple of my Latino reporter friends because they think I've gone to the dark side. It's painful, and I'm glad that I still have Latino reporter friends like Gregorio, and I see Santiago showed up, and some others whom I won't name. I won't put them in any difficulty. Who say that they say, Jerry, it's okay. We still like you. But that's a difficult thing because many folks take it very personally and wonder if they're about the guilt by association angle. Because there are racists who argue for immigration enforcement, they suspect that anyone who raises these questions might be racist. I spent 4 years covering the savings and loan scandal, which had its epicenter with a Phoenix financier named Charles Keating. And it was really a matter about regulation. And some who didn't like regulation complained that those who wanted to rein in the savings and loan were really anti-entrepreneur. They were anti-business, and there was a suggestion that maybe we were, communist. It's nonsense. And there needs to be a discussion on the facts, on the merits. But so often these controversial issues, they go right to the emotional issue of suspect motivation. Racism in our country has been discredited long since. It's no longer acceptable to run for office as an acknowledged, professed racist. It used to be okay, you could do it. Thank God it's no longer acceptable. And so it's a very ugly stain, and when someone throws it at you, it's painful. But one reason I came to work at CIS was that I thought it was nonsense. I thought it was anti-democratic. I thought that journalism should not cooperate with spreading the smear, and sometimes, frequently, journalism does cooperate with that smear. And I think that there are legitimate concerns to be raised, and I think CIS raises many of those concerns. I don't agree with everything that Mark says. Mark doesn't require that I agree with everything that he says, but I think that we need to have an open, honest, civil, and well-informed debate.
Ditto, Jerry. But just one point, I actually wrote for ethnic media. I'm Armenian. I wrote a weekly column for an English language Armenian paper. And I think it's a category error to put non-ethnic mainstream media in the same category as ethnically specific media. I mean, they're different animals. They're different things. And they're going to operate by different rules. So, I mean, in a sense, sort of what TED does, because I think, Univision clearly is ethnic media, and what you see in, weeklies and in radio and all that, it doesn't bother me all that much because it's kind of like, well, it's a different kind of thing from the Washington Post or NBC News. That's kind of my take.
I disagree, and I won't take too long in saying it, but it just takes, and with all due respect to Fox News, but it just takes flipping on Fox News for an afternoon or Googling, your top 10 over-the-top Fox News conservative moments or something to know where that network aligns. And the same thing goes even for the big papers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which I, in both cases, consider, pretty good places to look for the center opinion on things, from the left and from the right. But you still know which paper is coming from which angle, and there's a reason that Marco Rubio goes to the editorial board at the Wall Street Journal to get advice on his immigration reform bill, and not to the editorial board at the New York Times. I think you see it in mainstream journalism. Perhaps it's more subtle, or perhaps it's just because you're looking at them as if they're this sort of mirror reflection of as if this is sort of the true way, the way things really are. Instead of looking at them as what they are, and that's outlets with some degree of a voice in all cases.
Yeah, we have a question there. Oh, two questions. Yeah, you first. Either way, yeah, okay. Go ahead, sir. You identify yourself too, please.
Prakash Khatri was the former CIS ombudsman at DHS. Jerry
It's
and
USCIS, so
well, yes,
we got CIS first. Yes,
but it was the Citizenship and Immigration Services ombudsman. Question for all of you on the panel. It seems that in looking at what the media has been covering, one of the things that becomes very readily apparent for someone who's looking at it from a different perspective is that the media is almost, or the media or whoever it is, has almost created an environment where we've created a second-class person in a strange kind of way, which is rivaling almost, going back to the Confederate or the slavery days where we had a second tier of human being. What is your thought on how illegal immigration has really created that, or the term illegal immigrant has really created that kind of an environment where we actually have come to accept two classes of human beings who are created equal?
Mickey, you want to take the illegal
Question.
alien issue?
And I think Mark may agree with me or not. I'm against all sort of the some of these schemes are on the right at trying to sucker the right into supporting amnesty that would create a second class of citizens who can't, of people who live here who can't become citizen. I think if you're here illegally, you should be able to be a citizen, but the question is, who is here illegally? I think if we had open borders, or if we have a massive amnesty, that will create an ugly, socially inegalitarian society, because people at the bottom will not be able to make enough money to participate as full citizens in society. We will have people who are entrepreneurs who start their own restaurants who do very well, but the people who wash dishes will never make enough money it's just below the minimum necessary to participate in society. And we've made a deal with the working poor. We say if you work every day for 40 hours, you'll be able to make enough to live with dignity and to be an equal citizen. And I think, if we had open borders, we would be like Rio de Janeiro. We would not have that society.
Yes, let's take the last question.
Lennox Abrigo with Cush Churches United to Save and Heal. I wondered if you gentlemen, and first I need to applaud the fact that you gentlemen are doing this press conference to state your right to object. I think it's always a good thing to have a different perspective. I support a negative heuristic, which includes the search for what is true by looking for what is not true about what is true. So, so the ability to object, I think, gives a better perspective of everything, because it is the clash, as Popper said, it is the clash of unlike ideas that produces what is true. My question is, have you gentlemen considered black immigration? And there is a tendency in media to discuss immigration only from the perspective of border security, as well as the perspective of undocumented or illegal immigrants. And a lot of people in mainstream culture equate as synonyms immigration with illegal. Black immigration is a whole different story. And I'm asking if you gentlemen would discuss that for a minute, because there are no, black countries don't share a border with the US. So there are no black illegal immigrants. They're black immigrants who are in a status who have overstayed their time. But all black people who come to this country as immigrants, because we don't share a border, we don't walk into America, we don't swim across the Mediterranean or the Atlantic Ocean. So black immigration is something that I'd like to hear you address. And the issues of black immigrants are left out in the debate if we only limit the debate to border security and illegal immigration. Blacks contribute to the US economy before they come here, because we have to pay for our visas, as well as $240 billion is what the immigration earning power is.
I got the question,
billion.
so let's let people respond. Anybody have any I have some thoughts, but I'll let other people have thoughts first.
I mean, a quick note, I think that's an interesting thing to bring up. I'm thinking anecdotally, one story that I wrote when I was working on Long Island was about a family that had come from the Caribbean. I recall that they were Jamaican, and they came legally on a visa, and basically, and at the time, I think they also, one of them at least had a social security number so that they could work and use that number, but over, after a certain amount of time it expired, and they stayed and kept working for something like 13 or 15 years. But it was a really interesting story, because to walk into their house kind of felt like you were in anyone else's house, but to hear kind of how they lived their life was much different. They still paid their taxes. They used actually that same, the government would take the tax money. I mean, they were able to use that number and pay the IRS each year. Even though it was technically expired, or their work status was technically expired. But hearing some of the challenges that they faced, it would be things like taking they had a daughter who was born in the U.S., but she was without status too, but having her go out at night and worrying that maybe they knew she wouldn't get in trouble, but maybe one of her friends would get drunk, or the cops would pull her over and ask for her ID, and then they'd come back to the house. And there was just this constant fear, almost not for themselves, but thinking about their daughter, and when she would go out at night, that there wasn't necessarily, they'd be checking their cell phones to make sure that everything was okay. And I guess that just, I remember doing that story and meeting these people, and it kind of hit home for me. Obviously it's not a general look at an immigrant population, but it's one story.
I think there's one point, the issue you raise is legitimate, but it's not black immigration versus non-black. It's Hispanic immigration versus everything else. And the reason you see the issue debated as a Hispanic issue is that 75 to 80% of illegal immigrants are from Latin America, Mexico and Central America primarily. And even when you look at all foreign-born people in the United States, slightly more than half identify as Hispanic. So, I mean, in a sense, this is sort of where I'd let reporters off the hook, because it's almost like, I mean, I remembered when I lived abroad, people would say, well, why don't more people in America speak Georgian or Azerbaijani or Armenian? I was in Armenia for 2 years. Well, how many languages are people going to learn? You know what I mean? And in a sense, if you're a reporter, you've got a certain amount of space to fill, and writing about, if you're writing about illegal immigration, most of the stories have to be about Latin American illegal immigrants because they make up 3/4 or more of the illegal population. I understand what you're saying, but there's a limit, the other, whether it's black immigration or European or Middle Eastern or Asian, it's a smaller part of the story is inevitably going to end up getting less of the attention.
And getting back to the theme of the press and immigration, I think one story that's very badly underreported by the American press is the effects of immigration on Black Americans, Native Americans. A couple weeks ago, there was a press conference held here by a group of black leaders who were objecting to the Gang of Eight bill, pointing out the effects that they say, the very serious negative effects on African American employment, the displacement effect. This is a story that I think our press has almost systematically ignored because it's very uncomfortable as part of their narrative. Liberals are supposed to be concerned about our own minority citizens, people who are vulnerable, people who need protection. There is a great deal of energy expended in that direction regarding immigrants who frequently fit those categories. I mean, who is more vulnerable than someone in the country here illegally? But the story of the displacement of African American workers, I think, is terribly covered in the American press.
I'm going to wrap it up to respect people's times. Any last thoughts, anybody? No? The panelists will be here to accost afterwards, I think, so feel free. The video of our this event will be up on our site, I think, by the end of this week, if not early next week. So you can watch it at cis.org. And thank you for coming.